Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Pope Metallicus, and welcome back to a special edition of Rock and Roll Religion, where we are continuing our deep dive into the history of the genre from 1955 to 1970 at least. And then if you guys like this series even more, I may continue doing it. So to recap where we've gone so far in episode one, we have gone from, the early days with artists like Fats Domino and Elvis Presley in 1950 or 1952 to 1955, really, to the rise of what we would consider modern rock and roll in 1955 with Chuck Berry and Little Richard, and have gone right up until about 1960, which is right about what we're going to pick up, because there's a whole bunch of really interesting things that happen right about this point, in that you have a whole bunch of things that are about to happen. But before we get into that, welcome back to the people who are coming back. Welcome to those of you who are just here for the first time. I see Commander Phil in chat. Always good to see you, dude. So to get it out of the way, every Sunday you can find me doing the regular episode of Rock and Roll Religion right here on this channel. So if what I do here tonight, appeals to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And we do this every week. And if you guys really like this kind of content, leave me a comment down below, and we'll keep going into we'll keep going down this rabbit hole. And Sport and all of these guys will try to be here. I've gotten messages from both of them saying they're going to be, running late due to some personal issues or whatever. So hopefully they'll be able to get here. If not, you guys will be stuck with me for the evening. Hopefully they show up, because no one wants to hear me run my suck for 2 hours. So but if not, we'll just go down the list and I'll tell you my take on it, and maybe we'll do a makeup show where we kind of do a more discussion-y version of these events. But we'll see how that goes. And as always, you can join us on Gilded down at the link in the description. If you guys want to, be part of the conversation, talk about topics, or just come hang out with us in a Discord-like thing that's a little more loose with their TOS than Discord is. I know at least 2 guys in chat right now are already part of that Discord. And Beerly Gully, great name, man. I love it. And if you do want to support the show, again, you don't have to do this, and I wouldn't really recommend it. Seems like a waste of money, but if you do feel like supporting the show, I do have a Stream Elements link down in the description. So if you want to throw me a couple of bucks here or there, it is appreciated. And thank you in advance if you do. And I'll read your chats out if you send me a message as we go through the show here. I'll check it periodically. But we pick up the scene in 1960. Chubby Checker has just released a Twist, which is a massive, insane success. There's a new sound coming out of Southern California that is starting to take off in like 1960 to 1961 that will come to be known as surf rock. And, we will get right into it here with this guy right here. This is Dick Dale. He's the guitar player that is widely credited with having kind of studied not studied, but created the style that would come to be known as surf rock. It's a very interesting style. It's traditional, like it's actually got a lot of Hispanic and Middle Eastern influence, which makes sense because he is part Lebanese, and there's a large Hispanic community that was kind of having an influence on rock and roll in this time with guys like Richie Valens, and later on Carlos Santana will kind of run with that. But they're kind of adding their little bit into the 50s rock and roll sound, and it'll kind of mutate a little bit into both instrumental forms with bands like the Surfaris with Wipeout. And then, obviously, the big one out of this scene is going to be the Beach Boys in 1962, coming out with a more vocal rock and roll. So you've got these two sides of that period of that, and this will last throughout the 60s, really. I mean, the Beach Boys are still common, and I believe all these guys really kept their careers going in their local scene, at least in the local scene, if they weren't super popular across the country into the early 70s. And hey, Sentinel, always one of my co-hosts on here, loves to be here when he can. Good to see you all. Christian Delorme, good to see you, my dude. The Bruins are facing the Canadiens tonight, so hopefully we can beat them. But no, it's a interesting time for rock and roll, because there's something on the horizon that is just about to pop up and kind of drives these guys out of the spotlight. And there's also the Motown movement, which is more R&B, but we'll cover it here because R&B is a influence on rock and roll, with Motown in the early 60s. That it's called Motown because of Motown Records in Detroit, but it's actually coming out of not only Detroit, but Chicago, LA, St. Louis, a lot of the areas where rock and roll originally formed. So like anyone hears people talking about Motown and stuff like that, that's what they're referring to. So while all this is going on in the United States, and by the way, television is starting to become a thing. So they're starting to release movies and stuff like that too, with Dick Dale and the Beach Boys and all that. They kind of start like the movie it's almost a primitive form of music video, where like these movies will get released, and the whole thing is basically to showcase the band, essentially. Elvis makes a ton of them. The Beach Boys made one or two. Dick Dale, I think, stars in a couple. It's like the kind of American surf movies of the early 60s. And across the pond, there had been this group of bands that had been kind of gaining in popularity throughout the late 50s and into the early 60s, with the most famous of them, later on anyway, being a band by the name of the Quarrymen, formed in 1957, with the main guys in the band. Like, obviously there was a rotation of guys that were part of the scene at the time, but you'll know these three because they go on to be very important later. Three young men from Liverpool by the name of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison, who would obviously go on to form the Quarrymen, would evolve over time in the 1960s into the Beatles. And we'll get there in a little bit. First, check my tip jar, Christian. There we go. There we go. Hang on, let me copy and paste this into the chat because I don't know how to do the whole bringing it up thing because I suck at this. There we go. And Christian Delorme for 669 saying I had to put that amount. This might buy you a drink in Virginia. It will, actually. Surprisingly, down here things are very cheap. And thank you very much. And cheers to you, man. That'll probably go into my things for the show fund, where I do have some ideas on equipment and software and shit like that to improve this setup. So as we go along here, we might actually get some production value in this show. Won't that be fun? But yeah, there's all these different musical movements that are starting in the right about 1960, which is where we can kind of start, and they're all kind of percolating under the surface. Obviously, you still have the main focus of popular music at the time being the existing acts, like Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard. They're all still very popular. So that's kind of the mainstream right now. And then the surf rock stuff kind of is a little bit underground in the early 60s and will come to prominence later in terms of radio play. But we'll figure on 1961, 1962, kind of there's a whole bunch of bands doing that, whether it be these guys, Dick Dale, whether it be the Beach Boys, and this is really early on. I think picture was taken when they were playing a high school arena in or a high school auditorium in like 1962, which was really cool because this is really early on in their career, and this is all happening in like Southern California, in between like San Diego and LA, right where you'd expect, like the South Bay area, and go like the real surfing handle. And Sentinel, my Twitter handle, I don't have one, so feel free to, everybody feel free to tweet this out and share the stream out. We're going to get into it as much as we can here. Obviously, I was expecting having a couple of guests on to share what they know, especially 70s, considering he knows the British side of all this much better than I ever will. But we'll do what we can, and hopefully they'll be around. If not, well, we'll do what we can. And you had the Bel Airs in there with a little bit of like the R&B influence still, where they still had that saxophone sound, which was much more indicative of early rock and roll. And surf, a lot of like the vocal side of surf rock tends to be more of a mix of like surf rock and doo-wop. And right about this time in 1959, a band named Elf is coming out, kind of unrelated to this in the doo-wop genre. But the singer for that band will go on to become very, very famous in a young man by the name of Ronnie James Dio, who, if we continue the series, we'll get to eventually, because he's one of my favorite singers of all time and extremely talented young guy at this point, and will go on to be an absolute legend. And right about this time, 1963 is late 1963, obviously, November 22nd, 1963, you have the assassination of JFK. And at that time, the Beatles are just gaining a lot of popularity in England. And the U.S. is a lot of American outlets are kind of in search of something positive that they can put on the radio and on the TV in order to, kind of calm people down and get everybody out of their own little headspace. And as a result, you start hearing the Beatles over here on their first album in early 1964, and then in February 1964, you have the absolutely famous. Actually, famous doesn't even describe it. It was a cultural event. This wasn't even just a musical thing. The attendance for this show, or the viewership for the Beatles' appearance on Ed Sullivan, that's him in the middle, is absolutely insane, and swells up to something along the lines of 100 million, which makes it, I believe, either the second or third most watched broadcast in human history. Number one being the moon landing, and President Kennedy's funeral being the one of the other two. I can't remember which one had higher viewership. So it is impossible to overstate the sheer impact the Beatles had on America when they came. It was absolutely insane, to the point where you can hear in the recording of Ed Sullivan. I wish I could play a lot of this stuff, but unfortunately YouTube is getting even worse with copyright than it has been in the past, so I am just avoiding playing any video clips whatsoever. Period. And there were some other artists on that show. I believe Sam Cooke was on that show. He was one of the performers that came on before, and but just the audio level in that studio, just full of screaming teenagers, was to the point where they could barely hear themselves playing. This is before the era of what we would come to know as like the rock band, with the massive stack of Marshall amps with all these big loudspeakers and all that. That would more come out in the 70s and into the 80s. So at this time, we're featuring a couple of electric guitars, an amp, or one amp each, really, and a little speaker. And then the drummer is just trying to drum as hard as he can, because I don't know if the drums were mic'd up yet. That happens a little later, I believe. And the Beatles actually had a big hand in uh, recording technology and all that, and pioneered a lot of those techniques of kind of. Yep, Christian. I'll go into Motown a little bit here. They're not strictly rock and roll, but that's more towards the mid '60s. So we'll get to them a little bit. I didn't do a ton of research into them because it's kind of a sidetrack, but it does figure into the whole '60s America sound. And so it's a really interesting period in America. Like I said in the first episode, rock and roll played a huge cultural role in the mid '50s to into the '60s, being a huge force for social change as well. For the first time, guys like Alan Freed were playing not covers by white artists like Pat Boone on the radio. They were playing the original black artists, and for a lot of people, this was the first time that American white people had ever heard black music. Because jazz, R&B, all that was all rock and roll, or rock and roll essentially at the beginning was all considered black people music, and that's who did that, and it wasn't proper to play it on mainstream radio. And throughout the '50s, the attitude on that changed very rapidly, and played a big role in the civil rights movement coming into this period. And like '63, '64 was like a lot of the real racial tensions started bubbling up in America. There was all sorts of Supreme Court decisions being handed down and talk about civil rights and the end of Jim Crow, a lot of the Jim Crow laws in the South. I won't go too far into that here because that's, first of all, well-traveled information at this point, and also kind of outside the scope of this video. But suffice it to say, there was a lot of social change going on in this period, going right into 1964. And popular music like the Beatles and stuff like that was kind of a unifying force, because honestly, no matter which side of the argument you were on, most people, at least most young people, could get together and listen to bands like the Beatles or, the Beach Boys or stuff like that, and it kind of became a cultural touchstone a little bit, in that they all listened to rock and roll. So that became kind of very important culturally. And to see a British band come over here and tap into that, I mean, when was the last time you heard a band come to the States on a tour and it get called like Beatlemania and things like that in the mainstream press? Like, these guys weren't just in the local, like the trade magazines, or it wasn't a big deal on the local scale. These guys were national headline news in places like the New York Times. Hell, Walter Cronkite was talking about it on the evening news. It's insane, the lengths that people went to, or the kind of things people were doing with this. It was bonkers. And this was just the start. Like, this wasn't just the Beatles. There was a whole wave of what would come to be called the British invasion of bands from like 1962 to 1960, or 1964 to 1966, really. That would start to become really popular over here. The big three of that being the Beatles, obviously, and then the Rolling Stones being the next big one in like '64 and into '65, with a whole like songs like "Start Me Up" and "Brown Sugar" and all that. Like they really were something different that no one in the U.S. had ever heard before. And it really was an interesting period, because you had another culture in England kind of taking what was being done with the early rock and roll stuff and then putting their own spin on it and giving it back to us. And it was hugely popular. I mean, it gets into all sorts of shit. And yeah, Christian, we are going to bring up the Dave Flarek 5 in just a little bit here. And these were, I'm going to mention the big three here, and show them your pictures, but there was a huge influx of bands from the UK in this period. I mean, you have bands like the Hollies, Eric Burden and the Animals, the Kinks, all of these bands that you would know very well. Small Faces a little bit, who were less famous in America at that point, but the members of which would go on to be very famous. Guys like Rod Stewart. And they really were just this entire genre unto themselves, almost like the new wave of British heavy metal would become about a decade later, going into the late 70s and early 80s. And they kind of had their own sound and their own Van Morrison as well was right about this period. And we get into and one of my favorites out of this, The Who. These guys were extremely different from either the Stones or the Beatles, because that was the cool part, is each one of these bands had their own unique sound. Like the Beatles were much more of the pop music, somewhat boy bandish sound that was very clean, very family friendly, and more mainstream, we'll say it that way. And the Stones, and especially the Who, were just about playing rock and roll. And the Stones certainly never shied away from being controversial when they thought they needed to. And the Who were just this kind of outspoken, just super loud, absolutely mind-blowing music for the time, because I think their first album is 65. And they were coming out with songs like My Generation and stuff like that, which is almost proto-punk in a lot of ways, which if we ever do a history of punk, we're definitely going to be mentioning those guys again, because they all kind of had a unique tone to them and a unique sound that made them stand out from each other. From 1964 to really 1968 to 70, we're talking these guys dominate the charts. Everything the Beatles touched turned to gold. The Rolling Stones were up in the top 100 every month. The Who were all over the place. The Dave Clark Five, the Hollies, the Zombies. All of these guys had a huge, huge market in the U.S., and some of whom were actually far more popular in the U.S. than they were in Britain at the time. And we've seen that phenomenon since, where a lot of bands in the early 90s, especially when metal wasn't very popular over in the US, in Europe it was huge. There were bands that were from the US that basically didn't tour in the US for years, if not a whole decade. And some of them still don't. I know Manowar, they're an American band, but they hardly ever perform here anymore because their audience is mainly in Europe and the UK. So it's a really interesting kind of phenomenon where you can never really predict where your music's going to get popular or who it's going to resonate with. And when you come into output and stuff like that, I think you have to mention the Beatles as an all-time champ here, because you have a band that was only together as the Beatles and recording albums for 7-8 years. And in that time, they produced 21 studio albums, toured the world 8 times, and were just absolutely and did 3 movies in the meantime too, 3 or 4. I'm hardly the biggest Beatles expert. That's usually Scott and 70s thing. I just know a lot of their backstory and what I know from growing up with it. But their sound also evolved a lot over the course of their career, and going into 65, 60, or not 65, but from 66, 67, they started to experiment a lot more with the psychedelic side of rock and roll that was starting to emerge, coming out of the Summer of Love in 67 in San Francisco, and started to kind of feed into the hippie movement a little more early on. There are other bands that we'll get to probably in the next episode that will kind of get more into that, whether it be Jimi Hendrix or early Black Sabbath or Deep Purple and stuff like that. And we'll get more into that in the next installment here. but it's impossible to overstate like the influence these guys had on everything that came later. I mean, the Beatles, everybody. I don't care what genre of music you listen to. I don't care what, you know, what your taste is in music. The Beatles had an influence on it, whether it be their recording style or how they produced albums, or the fact that they used to release. The really cool one is the fact that the Beatles released singles that were not on the album. So there were a couple of singles that were like double A sides and stuff like that that were just little albums that they wanted to sell independently, and you would get that from them, which was kind of the first time that happened. Usually these songs would be sold as singles, but they would also be on a larger LP if you wanted to buy it that way. And only the really popular stuff, or the stuff that people thought was going to be popular, would make it onto the singles. But nowadays, you'll see that bands like Sabaton do this every now and again, where independent of an album, they'll drop an EP that's like one or two songs that they think, or that are just kind of their own standalone thing. And that was, and the Beatles were kind of one of those that did that. And when it comes to production quality, I mean, in 1960, you're talking probably your average production studio would probably have one mic for the vocalist and then one mic for the entire rest of the band. Because in previous decades, you would have a large band, probably like a 15, 20 piece band, like swing or jazz or stuff like that, all playing off each other and perform and being recorded as kind of a unit behind the singer. Whereas the Beatles kind of pioneered using, with the advent of 4-track recording, like you could have a separate track and a separate channel for each instrument. So you could have much more sound fidelity in that you were recording the individual sound from each instrument and then compiling it into a mix, rather than just recording the whole thing almost live and then just scrubbing some of the sound out, some of the background noise out of it. So the production quality jumped massively in the 60s due to that. The Beatles were and EMI were one of the first record labels to really jump on it. And the Beatles were always like the leading edge of technology when it came to recording techniques and stuff like that. And also newer amps and stuff like that. They were always playing around with their sound, trying to find something better. And they ended up, pioneering a lot of stuff that everybody then later used. And we'll get into them, the Dave Clark 5 here. These guys were huge in the US for a long, long time. They had a number of major chart-topping hits. And these guys are all just English bands that were barely getting their start in England. It's not like it would become in later decades where bands would get established in their own local market, and then kind of, if you made it and if you were really successful, you might open for somebody on a North American tour and then maybe get your own one day. These guys had barely started their careers in 1964 anyway, and were a massive, just smash success in a country the size of the US. So these guys succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, and in a real way, like that's kind of the dream of every rock and roller, is everybody loves you, and everybody listens to your music. And yeah, there's some stories from when the Beatles met Elvis that because he was one of their heroes. They did a ton of covers of his stuff when they were the Quarrymen, and also in the early stuff in the Cavern Club in Liverpool, and they were just massive fans. And then they got to meet him, which must have been really cool for them. And probably pretty cool for Elvis too, because Elvis was at the height of his popularity in this period, in like the mid 60s. Like he was a cultural icon. Actually, I think at some point in the interviewing period here, he was in the army. I think from like 61 to 64, he was in the U.S. Army, making kind of training and propaganda films for them, and kind of appearing almost as like a walking recruitment poster going. And from 64 from 65 to 68 here, we'll say, just for the sake of brevity. America is also starting to get involved in the Vietnam War. And obviously, that has a huge impact on the culture here. It was fairly low level in 65. It wasn't the Marines and some Army advisors were in there. And then in late 65, you started having things like the Battle in the Ia Drang Valley and stuff like that. If you've ever seen the movie We Were Soldiers, that's the one I'm talking. And would go on into kind of spiral into what the Vietnam War became later on. That happened in February of 68, though. The Tet Offensive massively spiked the scale of the conflict out of control. But this, and that was kind of going on at this point. Obviously, in the background, you have the Cold War, which with the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, a lot of American teenagers had a lot of angst and a lot of anxiety about that. And again, they turned to rock and roll to kind of alleviate some of that and give them that escape from reality. Yeah, that's true. Everybody took inspiration from these guys musically. From a business and marketing standpoint, they changed the way that music is packaged and marketed. And an interesting note to people who may not know this, most of the original releases of the Beatles albums in the US are not only in a different order, but they have different songs on them from the British release. I don't know what it was, but in this period, a lot of albums would not get brought to the US in the same form they were in the UK. I'm not entirely sure why that happens, but fortunately now, if you go out and get the remastered ones and stuff like that, they will all be the original UK format, which I think I said it on Scott's channel last week. I believe is the true version of those albums. I always go with the original release because that's probably the closest to what the artist thought was the finished product. So I'll always defer to the artist when it comes to the definitive edition of their work. Because that's one thing I've always enjoyed about old LPs is you're getting the music in one package as the band wants to show it to you. So I always recommend that you listen to full albums and stuff like that. If you've been here for any length of time, you hear me rant about it constantly on Sundays. That is the true experience and the way that the band wanted you to hear it, rather than this a la carte. I'll buy this track and that track and then listen to those and that's it. Yes, yeah. 10 years after. Yeah. But there's a whole list of these bands that probably 30, 35, Christian, of bands that just made it huge in the United States. And some of them have kind of gone by the wayside after their 15 minutes of fame were over. Because, you'll have that in every decade of bands that come out with an amazing album or one really, really good hit and then kind of just fade into the background and never really approach relevance again. And then you'll have bands like the Rolling Stones who are still going today, even though we really, really wish they would stop. I mean, let's face it, the last really good Stones album was what? Sympathy for the Devil in 1976. And the Who had a good long career and all that. And some of these guys stuck around for a really long time. And then you'll have bands like the Beatles who were super influential, really, really changed the game, but were only around for 8 years. So, and of course they all went on to other things later on with Paul McCartney with Wings, John Lennon doing his own solo project, George Harrison doing his solo stuff, all of which is pretty good. I enjoy quite a bit of it, and especially George Harrison. He's a underrated guitar player and a pretty damn good songwriter too. And then, of course, you had Ringo, who did one album on each one, and then went on to be the conductor on Shining Time Station. Like when I was a kid, Depending on when you grew up in the 80s, your conductor for Thomas the Tank Engine was either George Carlin or Ringo Starr. Whoever thought it was a good idea to give either one of those guys a kids show, I don't know. Yeah, and then there was. We'll get to Jimi Hendrix more next time, and I'm gonna do a whole section on him because again, he changed the game when it came to how guitar is played and stuff like that. Even though he wasn't around for very long, unfortunately. But in this period, he was actually coming up. We'll cover it a little bit here, like his origins, because from like 65 to 67, he was coming up in London. For those of you who don't know, he was actually at one point in the U.S. Army. He was in the 101st Airborne, and then after that, he was in England for a while, I believe studying, and then he dropped out of that and started playing music full time, and was playing the club scene in London right about until 67. So he was starting to get his start over in England. So that's kind of an interesting reversal of that, in that you have an American who was starting to gain popularity in England. And then you also had bands that would be much more important later in the scene that were starting to form in England, like bands like the Yardbirds, who would go on to, or members of whom would go on to other bands like Cream, Led Zeppelin, Jeff Beck, obviously. So you had that going. You had the Byrds and all that in this period as well, with kind of that more folk rock scene. You had this whole California music scene that was going on in the background, and you also had the beginnings of Carlos Santana's work in, I believe, 66. So like there's all sorts of things happening, more than I can possibly go into and have it make sense in any kind of depth. But this is all kind of just dovetailing into and kind of amalgamating into the larger, what would come to be called classic rock genre in the 60s and 70s, where you have all of these influences and all of these bands from two different continents at this point starting to smash together and create a more unified sound. The same way you saw in the 50s, because you had that St. Louis and Chicago style R&B and jazz stuff that would start being called rock and roll, things like Rocket 88 or some of Bill Haley and the Comets work, colliding with the more southern rock and roll studios like Sun Studios in Nashville and stuff, or Memphis rather, and kind of amalgamate into and yes, you're right. Comic Relief Crusader, good to see you, man. Always glad to have you around. And yeah, small time, you're right. Jimi Hendrix did play with Little Richard for a while, which wish I could find a recording of that stuff, because that would be really cool. I love Little Richard and I adore Jimi Hendrix. So that'd be really cool to see the two of them play off each other. And yeah, Fleetwood Mac started around this time. I'm not super familiar with their early stuff. I haven't really done a deep dive into Fleetwood Mac yet. I plan on it at some point, because I do dig a lot of their stuff, and I dig a lot of things that they have covered or that have been covered by other bands. Things like the Green Manalici by Judas Priest and stuff like that. So I will probably do that at some point. But yeah, they're first getting their start at this point. And again, a lot of this will go into probably the third episode we do on this, which will be like 68 to 1970, because there's a lot of stuff that happens in there. Obviously, the Vietnam War escalates very heavily. You have the rise of like a lot heavier bands, like the Kinks started and the Kinks and the Zombies are kind of the beginning of this heavier style of rock, what would probably be classed as hard rock today, and that's kind of where it starts. And then you have bands like Deep Purple and Led Zeppelin starting in like 68, 69 to really get heavier and bluesier. Jimi Hendrix as well is starting to go down that route. And then in 1970, we'll end it off there with the rise of a foursome from Birmingham that would go on to change the face of music forever, a band by the name of Black Sabbath. which we'll just go into the very beginnings of that here, where they were actually forming in the UK about 1968 as a blues band named Earth. So throughout 68 and 69, they would really kind of amalgamate and form their sound. And in 1970, they released their first two records. The second of which, Paranoid, which is an immortal classic, was actually released on the day Jimi Hendrix died. So we'll get into a lot of that, and we'll go into a lot more of that scene from the more psychedelic and hippie side with the Grateful Dead, CCR, who I've already covered on this channel with our own Christian Delorme. So if you can go find that, it's one of the first episodes of Rock and Roll Religion we did, actually, because CCR is one of my favorite bands of all time. Certainly completely unparalleled in terms of their impact on American music going forward from there. Yes, the Gollywocks. We'll get into them a little bit too. But you have all of these things happening musically, more than I can cover and make any sense in one episode. And it's like, I kind of want to like slice them up, like slice it up and like cover like the British invasion here and go into, the surf rock scene, which was much bigger than I am letting on here. But they were also like basically the American side of popular rock and roll was like the Beach Boys, the Surfaris, Dick Dale, a whole bunch of these guys. Like that was the early 60s surf rock crowd. In the middle, you had guys like Carlos Santana, Elvis. You had the beginnings of what would become like modern country with Johnny Cash and Waylon Jennings and all that. Like it was this whole bit. The Allman Brothers can get their start around this point, for as do Leonard Skinner for the Southern rock guys. Like, so that's all forming in the background here. So the next episode, I think we're going to have a lot to talk about. Like that's going to be a huge, huge one. And unfortunately, again, we don't really get to drill down on this with guys who are a lot more expert on that topic because, unfortunately they couldn't make it. But it is what it is. We'll keep soldiering on, and we'll probably recap a lot of this in the next episode and get back into people like the Beatles and the Stones, because there's a lot of they have a lot of impact on what's going to come next. So we'll probably drill back into that on the next episode and kind of give you some more background on this. I just since it's just me, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what's going on in this period, and again, kind of emphasize the fact that this is a whole cultural movement at this point. Rock and roll went from being like the bastard child of American music and was like looked down on, and still was in a lot of places by, the parents of America, essentially. Like, the older generation as, the devil's music and shit like that. Because, Americans will never miss a chance to be puritanical about something. But but it's important that we recognize like all of these guys and and when they start coming in, it is a massive cultural shift in the mid 60s, because you all of a sudden have that British culture coming back and kind of cross-pollinating with, both Black, white, and Hispanic American cultures. And again, I said it in the first episode, and it really is true here, in that this sound is almost uniquely American in its origins and how it came about, because it was the right collection of ingredients at the right time, being, a lot of Black music and white American music, like country and Western, like Phil, there's a lot of connection between country and rock, because a lot of like the early rock and roll artists like Bill Haley and the Comets were actually a kind of failing country and Western band that did a couple of rock covers and catapulted them to the stratosphere. I think we covered that in episode 1 if you want to go take a look at it. but it was hugely important. And what country is a big chunk of what would become rock and roll. So like it all comes in, whether it be from blues, jazz, country, R&B, swing. Like it's all this big amalgamation of all of those sounds that kind of comes together in the mid 50s as what we would understand today as rock and roll. And yes, I have heard of the Flying Burrito Brothers. They're amazing. Just for the name alone. Just like that sounds like the kind of band I would go follow just because of them. And yeah, the Beatles did a lot of Motown stuff in the early 60s, a lot of rock and roll stuff too, like Elvis. They did some covers of some other stuff too. Buddy Holly was a big influence on them. And yeah, the Stones, you can hear it in the Stones sound that they're a lot bluesier than the Beatles are. Because the Beatles came from skiffle, which is sort of a British take on jazz that's very similar to rock in a lot of ways. And the reason that George, Paul, and John were the three that stayed in that band were the fact that they wanted to go in a more rock and roll direction, and the rest of the band kind of wanted to stay as sort of a jazz number. So in some alternate dimension, there is a version of the Beatles that no one ever heard because they stayed as the Quarrymen and were playing jazz tunes in some bar somewhere. And we're probably pretty good at that too, because I don't want to take away from the music. Like I can call them kind of a mainstream and kind of boy bandish, but they were all very talented musicians and they were writing extremely popular stuff. So I can't take anything away from them in terms of their output and their talent as musicians and songwriters. It sound like they sound kind of corny and stuff like that today, but that's also because this all happened 60 years ago, almost exactly 60 years ago, 59 years in the case of their appearance on Ed Sullivan and really their rise to prominence in America. So, you know, we'll get into a lot of their later career more later in the next episode. And again, we'll recap a lot of this. Again, guys, I'm sorry I'm not really giving you the full picture here, but unlike the last show, it's just me. So I did a lot of the dry research and stuff like that. But a lot, in some cases, 70s has actually seen some of these bands or grew up listening to them. So he can give you a lot of the UK side of it stuff. Scott is a huge Beatles fan, so he could give you a lot more in-depth stuff on them. And I'm just, kind of doing whatever research I can and kind of trying to explain the evolution of the sound and where it all came from, and also some of the kind of political and cultural impact that it all had, because it did. I mean, it's all interrelated. And we kind of go into the hippie movement in the late 60s, which we'll get into next time, I think. But with all that being said, obviously, if you like what I'm saying here and want to see more of it, that subscribe button's right down there. I'd appreciate it. If you haven't heard me before, those of you who have been here for a long time, thank you guys for coming out. And I'll hope to see you guys on the next one. Again, you can find me every week on Sunday for Rock and Roll Religion. Sundays at either 4 or 5 Eastern, depending on when works better for guests. And I think next we'll be covering Exodus. So if you guys are fans of 80s thrash, you're going to love to tune in for this one, because these guys are actually kind of underrated. And well, that's true, Soul Assassin, but a lot of them, grew up to be decent human beings later. So, and a lot of them didn't. So we'll get into that next time. You can find me every Monday for It's Only Talk and Roll over on 70s Rock Fans channel, where we've been doing an absolutely kick-ass series of interviews and kind of episodes with the Rock and Roll Rowdies. We're a bunch of roadies from England who all grew up in, I think, Hartlepool, who kind of grew up together and then became roadies and have toured for some really big name bands, including a couple we've talked about tonight, like the Who. So definitely give the Rock and Roll Rowdies a sub. They're really awesome. and they're great guys. Check me out over on 70s Rock Fans channel. Obviously, check out Sporking News Podcast if you don't already. They're amazing. And with all that being said, take care, stay safe. I love you all, and I'll catch you next time.